afternoon and welcome to the Full Scottish on Sunday, the 31st of October. My name's Maggie Lennon and I'll start the show as usual with the up-to-date coronavirus statistics. As of 2 o'clock yesterday, there were 3,867 newly confirmed cases of COVID-19, 20 new reported deaths of people who tested positive. 4,315,802 people have received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination and 3,905,177 have received their second. 926 people were in hospital with recently confirmed COVID-19, 65 of whom were in intensive care. Since the start of the pandemic, a total of 641,121 people in Scotland have tested positive for COVID, and sadly, 9,163 patients who tested positive have died. I'm joined in the studio today by SNP Councillor for Angus from the Kirriemuir and Dean Ward, Jools Bell, and down the line by Elaine Whyte, who is Executive Secretary of the Clyde Fishermen's Association. Welcome to you both. Before I get into the programme proper, I think we just need a bit of a word about these COVID statistics that I've just read out. That looks like a huge leap to 3,800 from the kind of average it's been of 2,500 for the last few days. But apparently this is because the Glasgow labs have been slightly under-reporting for the last day or two. So it still seems to be averaging out about 2,500 a day. The death rate, the 14-day average of the death rate is gradually going down. It's about 17. But Jules, I still think that's quite a high figure, 2,500. We seem to be plateauing at that. I'm not really sure why that should be. Is that something we should be concerned about?
It's certainly something that concerns me. I am a non-executive director of Public Health Scotland representing Cllr, and I do watch the figures. It does give me cause for concern, and greater scientific minds than mine are monitoring it, which gives me some high degree of comfort. But regardless of what the data is, there are political decisions to be made around where we go next with it. And I also sit on our local health and social care partnership, and people are really anxious about what's coming towards us for winter. I think we're all seeing a few more colds and coughs in the community, the sort of normal seasonal infections that we would expect at this time of year, and trends around norovirus, for example, going up too. So as people start to move out and about, we are seeing what we would regard as pretty normal seasonal infections. And the whole system, I think, is really concerned about the capacity to manage all of those issues collectively. It is worrying, there's no question about it, and the fact that we've got COP26 and so many more thousands of people coming into Glasgow will, I am sure, result in a spike of infections.
Yeah, and not just staying in Glasgow, but obviously people are travelling across Scotland. Elaine, I'm just wondering, that figure, that £2,500, that's 2,500 people a day roughly, would suggest, because it's static, that our number is at 1. So one person with the COVID is infecting one other person. Do you think with COVID, with COP26 looking like it might spike, do you think we need something to happen between now and the year end? Maybe not another full lockdown, but a circuit breaker, or what do you think would be the appropriate thing for us to do to be a bit more cautious?
I would echo Jules's comments that there's better minds than me that would be thinking about what should happen, but I do think we can certainly expect a spike, given the number of people who will be coming into the city. I think that would be expected. But in terms of what kind of action we do, as a result of that, I think we have to leave that to the professionals and the medical people who will be sitting around and considering what might happen. So.
Yes, and obviously we all have to take a bit of personal responsibility. So we've mentioned COP26, and today is the day it starts. People are arriving from all over the world to Glasgow. I am slightly concerned, I think to put it mildly, that the media expectations around COP26 are hyperparabolic, to say the very least. The Scotsman had a headline yesterday, 12 days to save the world. Now, it is obviously very serious, but is that actually, just with expectations like that, Jules, is that setting us up to fail?
I am torn between very hopeful about what can be achieved through COP26 and actually quite terrified that if we don't get some action, we will be running out of time. But I agree with you around, headlines like that aren't terribly helpful. There are people who've been campaigning on climate change and seeing the climate emergency for 40, 50 years, seen it coming. And I'm hoping we're at a critical mass now, because absolutely something has to happen. And while, things like recycling and, scattering wildflower seeds are really important for biodiversity and reducing waste, there are huge corporations that need to step up to the plate and deliver. And we need to sort out things like the taxation system as well. That I think that is a massive issue when funds are going offshore and not about delivering big mitigations in the country that will allow people to make a massive shift towards zero carbon.
It's not just media expectations though. So if you walk along the Clyde at the moment, you'll see on huge notice boards the UN, what they call the UN World To-Do List. And it's pretty impressive of all the things that the world needs to do. But the world's needed to do these things for a long time. So it's everything. It's, create better justice, better climate justice, gender equality, eradicate poverty, eradicate hunger, eradicate inequality, make better sanitation. So these are all things that absolutely are needing done. These are things that have the problems have been contributed to for decades. And I'm just wondering, Elaine, where you stand on this idea. Two camps seem to be developing. One that says it's politicians who have to take the action, and the other that says it's activists that have to take the action. My gut feeling is these problems are all being lumped in together with COP26, as if COP26 is going to suddenly make all of these issues better, all of these issues that are exacerbated by climate change and vice versa. But if it was that easy, why haven't we done it before? What have we been doing for the last 50 years? So again, I'm just wondering whether all of these expectations are just at the end of the 2 weeks, we're going to be left going, so what? What next? What do you think?
I don't think it sits at the door of just politicians. I think that we all have a responsibility to get involved. But I think my biggest concern is that we start looking for bad people and good people, and there's a polarization. Because actually, if everybody has to get on board with this, everyone has to listen to other people. And obviously, we hear a lot about just transition. And I think if we want to be just transitioning any people, we have to involve them in that debate. Because obviously, if you're talking, we see what's happening with the Insulate Britain protests, etc. And it may be a very good cause, but if it's polarising people, is it actually going to achieve what we want to do in the long term, which is sit down with people, work together and try and find practical solutions? So I do worry about the sound bites. I do worry about the campaigns. I think it has to be a well-managed framework which everyone can engage with, which doesn't exclude others and works with others in a sensible way to make change.
And do you think part of the problem also is, when you look at the figures, they're talking about a disaster coming at the end of the century. That's 80 years away. So very few people who are involved, well, no one who's involved with COP26 the next 2 weeks is going to be around in 80 years. Do you think that's also part of the problem? That people are kind of taking the view, well, it's kind of in the future, it's not really us, it might be our kids and our grandkids, but it isn't actually on the doorstep, because by the time it's on the doorstep, it will be too late to do anything. So Elaine, do you think that's also a problem, that people just don't quite buy into the urgency that is being sold to us, if you like?
Well, potentially it's one of the problems, but then I think you have to think about how you deliver that message. And if you're delivering that message by speaking to people or going to people in a rational way and saying, here is an action plan, this is what we can all do together, in the everyday channels that they engage with, I think there's a way that you can make change. But I think if it's just something that's polarizing people, or people who don't feel they can get on board with how the message is being delivered, I think that's an issue that we really have to take seriously.
Yeah, and obviously we're quite good at communicating these kinds of things maybe in the West, but that's maybe not the same in other countries where it's not as high on the agenda because there are other more pressing social issues. And although they're all linked together, people are not necessarily seeing that. One of the things that Greta Thunberg, who I have to say I find increasingly tiresome in her attacks. She's very much on that line of good and bad people, and that's probably not a popular thing to say about St. Greta. But one of the things she's made fairly clear, Jules, is that systems have to change. And I think we would agree with that. So the power systems that have been in play, the industry systems that have been in play, I mean, it's been going on since the Industrial Revolution. I guess we could kind of lay the foundations of climate change. But how are they going to change when the power rests in the hands of these global corporations? Really, they don't rest in the hands of politicians. They rest in the hands of very, very rich individuals, and often, which case, so how are we going to make that change? What do we need to do?
That's a huge question, and I'm absolutely sure I don't have a single answer to that. But that's, I think, where the power of people like us, ordinary people, comes into play. One of the biggest thing I guess that we need to do is move away from fossil fuels, and that's a really hard thing for people to do. And I represent a very rural community, and when you think about things like fuel poverty, for example, and access to local food, things, our supply chain needs to get better. Public transport needs to get better, but I guess there are parts of Scotland that we'll never have buses running regularly, and I think my ward is one of them. Where I live, there are no buses up my glen at all, and that's public transport has to, in cities, address that access issue. It needs to be a much better integrated system. Domestic transport is the biggest cause of carbon emissions in Scotland and the UK. So that's a real challenge for people. And if we're looking at, leading up to 2050, I think something like 70% of our population will live in cities. And what we don't want to do is denude the rural environment. We need people to live and work and live well and have good jobs in rural communities. Otherwise, our environment will be bereft, and that's not healthy either. So there, you were listing all those aspects that were being lumped in under climate emergency. I think so many of those are completely integrated and overlapping. It is hard to pull one out and say, well, that doesn't actually belong there, because a well-being economy, I think, is pivotal. We need to stop looking at, financial growth year on year as a marker of success for how we live as a society across the world. We need to look at well-being. We need to look at closing that gap between the rich and the poor. And if anyone has read the book The Spirit Level, you'll see that the greater the distance between rich and poor in countries, the poorer the outcomes are for everybody, the rich as well. So everyone who is wealthy has a vested interest in having a progressive taxation system, not finding ways to avoid paying tax. We need to change the narrative around taxation as a punishment. It's how you contribute to your society and how you level out those inequities for the benefit of everybody. And I think that is just such a big conversation that we need to have globally around the levels of wealth that we see people like Elon Musk hoarding,
Yeah, the figures
which is
that came out this week was shocking.
utterly obscene, when allegedly 2% of his wealth could actually solve world hunger.
I know, it's unbelievable. Would you agree with that, Elaine, that it's time to look at a different sort of economic model? Elaine? Oh, Elaine seems to... Elaine, yes. Would you agree that we need to have a different kind of economic model, more one based on wellness and away from the more traditional economic model?
Yes, I wouldn't disagree with that at all. But I do think that what we probably need, as Jules has outlined, is science and research, because we do have the capacity to do some amazing things. But I have to say, sitting at another end where I see what happens with science in certain areas, we're way behind where we could be on simple things, like just monitoring things like water temperatures, monitoring stocks in the sea, etc. So I think there's ways that we can get around those problems if we dedicate our time and resources to research and to science. I think that's a far better way to spend that time, and working collaboratively with the people who are likely to be impacted, because I do think so many of the people who are taking part in some of the direct action really have to speak to the people who would be impacted by a lot of these actions and try and find solutions together, not excluding anybody, because there are certain things that society needs, reliable transport, particularly to rural areas. So it's how we work together on that, and I think that's something that we really have to get the balance right on.
I'm quite encouraged by this theme that you're both coming out with, that it's really about it's about people power, it's about collaboration. There's one area that I don't think gets enough attention in terms of impact of climate justice. And so the straightforward question to you, Jools, is climate change a gender issue?
Oh, no question in my mind at all. And poverty affects women exponentially. But when you look at, some of the issues that we've got in countries around the world where climate change has affected them so badly that they're no longer able to grow crops to sustain their own society, and that's resulted in a move away from those countries and the refugees that we see moving across Europe. Young men, single men are a much more mobile demographic. And women are often, tied with their families and unable to make that transition. And they're the ones that are left fending, trying to grow family food in an environment that is just not sustainable, whether it's, increased rainfall or increased drought, and malnutrition is shocking. And it's really hard to develop a sustainable lifestyle in these countries. And when you look at that intersectionality around women and the poverty that families experience, I really struggle to see how we can solve that in the time frame, and I find that really quite distressing. But you'll find that here as well, that women and families are suffering the worst impacts of the universal credit cuts, for example. Single people, single men particularly, less impacted. So if you're a single mother with 2 or 3 children and have a disability as well, you are much more greatly impacted negatively by universal credit and the legacy benefits. So regardless of whether it's here or in Ethiopia or wherever, it's women on the real front line of climate change and poverty and hunger. They're all inextricably linked.
This is where I'm going to ask you both to put your cards on the table then. And so first with you, Elaine, do you think, 2 questions, do you think we will get anything out of COP26 that is really going to make a difference? And if you had one thing that you thought would be for you a marker of progress, what would it be? So big questions, I know, to throw at you, but...
Well, we have to hope that, as I said before, I think the one thing that I'm hoping that doesn't happen is polarisation, because I think we need to keep talking. So if there's a way to open up a dialogue between different countries and between different sectors of society, that's a good thing. However, I do worry that we may see a chasm of differences in opinion, and you can see it in social media. So I think we have to be careful about how that's managed. Sorry, what was the last question?
And if you had one thing that you thought was for you a mark of success, something you could say that's a positive, what would it be? What would you like to see come out of it that's achievable?
I think a focus on research and empirical scientific evidence. I think what we quite often talk about nowadays is things like best available science, which might mean it's the only science available in that area, but there's not actually anything that's been neutrally done, etc. So I think we have to have a commitment to actually finding out what our baselines are and how we can actually, and consequently, when we find what the problems are, we can find relative solutions. And I know that we all might know consciously what the issues could be or are likely to be, But I think the better we understand why they're happening and the better we understand how we can mitigate that is what I would ideally like to see. But it has to be based, I think, less on emotive politics and more on actually, well, what can we do to practically solve this? Because sometimes the emotions can get lost, and we really need a practical way out of these issues.
Okay, and Jools, same question to you. How positive or otherwise are you of any kind of outcome, and what would be your one thing to take away?
I'm generally quite a positive, hopeful person, so I'm going to cling, albeit precariously, to that aspect of myself, and hope that we get enough agreement on tangible actions that will make a difference. I think that I honestly think we have enough evidence to make significant changes now, and I'm sure that evidence will grow because research will continue. But the biggest thing that we need to do is to move away from fossil fuels. And when you think, going back to a previous question about gender justice, it's the patriarchy that's got the greatest control and power vested in fossil fuel industries. We need to absolutely move over to renewables at a much greater pace. And I speak as someone who does live in a rural community where the use of oil for our heating is very common, and I know it's going to be expensive to make that transition at a very personal and local level. But globally, we just need to stop ravaging Mother Earth and taking all those fuels from our body. I mean, we can, that needs to be done in conjunction with protecting all the species that are at risk, if not actually of going extinct, but very close to it. Everything that we do needs to be working holistically to protect this planet, and fossil fuels extraction is probably the biggest single thing that I would want to go for.
Well, that's two very strong messages then to the leaders who are coming to COP26. I hope some of them are listening in. Of course, some of the main leaders, some of the worst polluters, are not coming to the conference. So whether that makes a difference or not, we don't know. The other huge story this week in the press has been the fishing industry in the UK. Now, the fishing industry and agriculture in Scotland is now widely understood and accepted as one of the greatest victims of Brexit. But Elaine, so many people in your industry and in agriculture kind of voted for Brexit. In your opinion, is it worse than you expected, or is it pretty much what you were expecting when Brexit was announced that it was definitely going to happen?
Well, I've obviously came on this programme a number of times and on various other TV stations, and I have said everybody's experience of who voted for Brexit and who didn't varies. I work with a range of members. Some of them did and some of them didn't. So I think it's really important to clear that narrative up, because I hear all the time all of your members wanted this. You can go back to articles in 2016, 2017, where we were in the Financial Times saying, look, we are taking a constitutionally neutral position on this. It's a democratic vote. However, what we are saying is you have to be very careful about what's going to happen with the markets and the fallout for certainly our fishing communities, given that 86% of our produce goes to the EU. So I think we have to be very careful about brushing everybody under the same area that we all voted for Brexit, or all of our members. That isn't the case. There was a mix. There always was a mix. In terms of the situation right now, I think obviously it's not been the outcome that some of the pelagic and whitefish skippers would have hoped for in terms of getting more stocks. But our focus had always really been on the markets primarily. So if you're asking, is it easier or worse now? Far worse. Because we obviously have different conditions for exporting, which we knew we would have. It's more costly, and as you can see, we're going to have these diplomatic issues, which are likely to come about, and we felt this would always be the case. So no, I mean, certainly the inshore shellfish fleets, etc., are not in a good place at the moment. We're hoping that things can get better, but it's not been ideal at all.
And I think it's important, isn't it, to stress that when we talk about the fishing industry, we're not just talking about people who are out actually catching the fish or the shellfish. It's the whole supply chain. It's the haulage. It's the delivery. It's the fishing communities themselves. But I'm interested that you say these diplomatic rows, and we'll come on to those in just a minute, were kind of expected. So are you not really surprised at the fallout which has happened between, at the moment anyway, just France and the UK over the issuing of licenses? Are you saying that was always going to be on the cards?
Well, yeah, I mean, if you speak to a lot of our members, the first thing they said was, we're going to have issues. And I think initially some people said there will be direct action by French fishermen. But in reality, given the new regime, it doesn't have to be direct action, people burning tyres on the roads. All it has to be is somebody putting a pen through a piece of paper and saying, we're not taking your consignment for this reason or that reason. So in a way, yes, we had always raised that. And as I said, if you can go back historically, to 2016, you'll see that we said this. So it's not nice to be a Cassandra, but we always knew it was likely to happen.
And I mean, it's not the first time that fishing has become an issue that seems to play into the whole issue of British sovereignty. So I can remember the Cod Wars from decades ago. And just to remind viewers of what has happened. So the issue seems to have been that the UK have refused to give certain fishing boats licenses to fish in UK waters for various reasons. Some of them that the boats are quite new and therefore they can't prove that they'd always fished in these waters. And then that's resulted in France retaliating, and I think it was a Scottish trawler, am I right, that was held in port. Is that correct, Elaine?
Yep, that's correct. Yes.
Yeah. And now Macron is using it to ramp the narrative up even further and say, once again, this is the UK proving they can't be trusted in terms of negotiations, and that their stock, if you like, on the international world is falling because they're not to be trusted. They break negotiations, they break all sorts of unilateral agreements. And Britain saying, well, if that's the position you're going to take. In fact, one of the British ministers actually he was like sounding he was in a school playground going, well, if that's good enough for you, it's good enough for us, And you think, seriously, is this what it's come down to? Now, Jools, I always have a view that this feels a bit like masculine posturing. This is two men flexing their muscles and trying to be very macho about this. And it looks like we're in an impasse. So what do you think might happen next?
Well, whatever happens next, I think it needs to be a political resolution. I fear greatly for our fishing and farming communities. For those of us on the Remain in Europe side, I think this is all kind of predictable. I think we saw it coming to some lesser or greater extent. And regardless of who voted for it, I think we need to absolutely support our food producers through this. I'm not bothered about pinning blame on farmers or fishers for voting for Brexit. But we need to support them through this. We need to build confidence in Scottish food, Scottish produced food. And I remember prior to Brexit, a friend and colleague of mine, Heather Anderson, who's a councillor in the Borders, would say, if there's anything positive that could come out of Brexit, and it's a struggle to think of anything, it might be a greater emphasis on local food, supporting local food producers, connecting people in a much more meaningful way with where their food comes from, and shortening that supply chain. And I think, Scottish food has, we've got so much to be proud of in Scotland. We've got our fish, our soft fruit industries, Angus is potato central of the universe as far as I'm concerned, and I know people in Ayrshire will argue the toss about that, but I'm sticking to my guns on it. And our seed potatoes go around the world. I hate to see that being undermined, and I really want to see us talk up our local food. And there's just a lovely clip on Twitter today from the American Embassy, I think it is, around, trying out our Cullen skink, which went down a treat. Iron Brew, our Cranachan. I'm hoping it was Angus raspberries that were in that. We have a lot that we can share with the world, but we need to also celebrate that here and connect people with how we produce our food. And I'm really supportive of all our local community allotments in Angus around sustainability, community resilience, and shortening that supply chain to virtually, on the doorstep.
But Elaine, in terms of fish, when you said at the beginning of this section that the export market is so huge, I mean, it's not the case, is it, that an internal market is ever going to make up for the massive export of fish from Scotland to the rest of the world, is it?
No, it's not the case. However, I completely agree with Jules that we have to work on that. We certainly have to work in our domestic markets. I think during lockdown, we saw how many people were selling from boats directly and that there was local markets. The issue around about that is really the infrastructure, because we found that we had members who were maybe selling from the boat in Troon or Greenock, where there was quite a populous area. But if you were selling in Campbelltown or Tarbert, you had far less customers, and the difficulty was to try and get into the central belt and to have a kind of storage facility, etc. So there's a lot of resilience issues in local food chains that we could be looking at, I think. But in terms of it replacing the EU market, no, I don't think that's something that we would ever want to see. I think Jules is right about reputation of Scottish food, and Scottish seafood has an excellent reputation. And what we can't forget is that we have markets in Italy and we have markets in Spain. We also obviously have great markets in France. And there's people employed in those, in the processing and delivery and the selling of shellfish and fish, seafood, both here in Scotland, but also on the continent and those countries that I mentioned. So, while we have these political disagreements and issues, there's a risk that people in either side of the channel are going to lose jobs and a product that they want to share. So I really hope that this is sorted out quickly, because it is very detrimental for all fishermen in Scotland.
And can I ask, Elaine, and is the British government speaking to organisations like you about this? Are they consulting with you and saying, what do you want us to do about it? Or are you just being left to kind of pick up the news like the rest of us?
In this case, are they speaking to us about this
Yeah.
specific case? I'm sure they will be speaking to, we have regular meetings that are across the government. We have a meeting with Cabinet Secretary Goujon and also with the UK ministers too. So that happens every few weeks, really. So yes, they are keeping in touch with us regarding what's happening. We certainly are expressing our concerns. But in terms of the actual debate about licenses, we'll have to see the detail, but it sounds as if the Scottish skipper has obviously had a license, and there's been some kind of technical issue that has to be resolved. But, this will keep happening. In terms of whether it was morally right or not for the people, the French, to have access or not have access, it would really depend on track record. But what I would say is, sometimes these schemes are fair, sometimes they're not fair. And certainly we have issues with track record in Scotland. And, I certainly know that a lot of our members have lost out on the ability to fish fairly around about the Scottish coast because of track record systems. So I know how difficult they can be. In this case, I can't say whether it was justified or not until we see more of the detail. But, it's an issue we have to sort out domestically, both in the UK, Scotland, and with our partners in the EU.
Okay. Back on dry land for a minute then. The latest big news story that's been breaking just in the last 24 hours or so is that the Scottish Government are about to invest a huge amount of money into the NHS to create 139 new trainee doctors posts. Now, there's not an awful lot of detail in the press release that we've seen, so we don't know whether that's 139 in one go or over 5 years, or if it's 139 this year, it'll be 139 in future years. And it seems to be that this is money going into doctors' training once they've been through the foundation programme, which is the first 2 years that junior doctors do in hospitals before they choose their specialisms and move into other things. And it's an attempt to get people into some of the specialisms that are struggling: oncology, psychiatry, public health, and others. Now, very often when we talk about issues with the NHS struggling, Jools, the attitude is we need to throw money at a thing. And obviously, money is very important. But do you think this is the right thing to do at the moment? Or could you have spent that money, do you think, better? I think it's 33 million altogether.
Okay, I think money is always welcome, but you're right. It's not just about money, it's about the people to populate these jobs. And I know we've done a lot in Angus around upskilling the rest of the primary care workforce. So things like advanced nurse practitioners, community mental health nurses, physiotherapists, occupational therapists. And I think one of the challenges that we've had traditionally in Scotland is not necessarily the number of people who go into our medical schools to train up as doctors and who eventually become GPs, but those of them who go and work abroad, who leave the system. And that's a concern. And I mean, we do have a lot of doctors already trained up in Scotland, and a lot of them work part-time. So that is a real challenge as well. But I know doctors are, feeling a bit under the cosh at the moment, and that's not a narrative I want to perpetuate. Doctors are open at the moment, and they're very much delivering healthcare in a primary care setting. One of the issues that does keep coming up, and it works to varying benefits in different areas, is removing that GP as the gateway practitioner, so people being able to self-refer to specialists where that's appropriate, I think is a really helpful move, so that you don't always have to go to the GP first and then get referred on, because that whole chain can get very lengthy, and we need to be creative, I think, around how we reduce the backlog of health issues that have perhaps been created because of COVID. I am concerned around that backlog and people delaying going to their doctors, and I really would encourage people to not leave anything too late, because that has a greater impact, not just on your health and the scale of your treatment, but on the overall system. So I'm sure it's not the only money that we're going to see coming in, and we're looking at the creation of a national care service as well, which is another really important part of the service. And I think as health and social care become more and more integrated, opportunities for investing in different health practitioners will come about. I'm not expecting this to be the last investment, because it's not just about GPs, it's about the whole system. And I would absolutely expect that the Cabinet Secretary and the Health Ministers get that.
I guess it's a sexy headline, though, isn't it? It's about more doctors, and that's what people's automatic think is. Just in the part of Scotland that you're living in, Elaine, what's the health service been? How much under pressure has it been? Are you aware of any particular pressures? And what do you think should be maybe not a more appropriate, but what would be the appropriate way to deal with the shortages in the health service? And they are massive, I have to say. 139 doctors is a drop in the ocean. I mean, there's something like 500 GP vacancies alone. What would you like to see being the focus for investment in NHS going forward?
Well, I think like many other sectors, some people, obviously technology has changed what's possible as well. So I know some people are not fond in online consultations, etc. But it's the way of the world, and it's actually led to a lot of people having things picked up. I have a family member who managed to do an online consultation and pick something up. So I don't think they should be exclusively what we go to, but I think it's one way of maximising time for and resources as well, as it has been in every other business. But we also obviously need that personal touch as well. I think the issues that the NHS are facing, they had issues before, of course they did, and I think COVID has just has really has highlighted how stressed it's been, a very high pressure environment for any medical professional. But I do think that this is something that we're seeing across sectors. I certainly know that we've got a shortage in vets, we've got a shortage in fishermen, we've got a shortage in haulage drivers. I think now is a good time to take stock about how we recruit people, how we are employing people, what our structures are overall, because there's been a massive change to the country, and I think that's what we what we have to do now. But of course, any investment is very much welcomed, because we can see how stressed the NHS has been. And in my part of the world, I'm sure it's been not too different from everybody else's. I mean, we appreciate the job the NHS are doing, but any resources to them, it is a drop in the ocean, but it's helpful. But we have to rethink how we're employing everybody in general, I think.
It's not clear also whether this is new money that's come to the Scottish Government as a result of what's called a Barnett consequential. So that's when extra money is given to areas that are devolved in Scotland to their equivalents in England. Then money is added into the Barnett formula. It's called a Barnett consequential. It's not clear if that's new money coming from that, but it's likely to be, because obviously in the budget, Sunak did announce a massive investment into the NHS in England. Again, whether that was all new money or not, I don't know. One of the things, when Jools, you were talking earlier about a kind of holistic approach, and one of the things that I know happens in Angus that maybe doesn't happen elsewhere, and I'm really quite interested in as an initiative, is what's called social prescribing. Can you just very quickly give us an idea of what that is and how that sort of factors into a more holistic approach to health?
Absolutely. Well, one of the reasons we took an interest in social prescribing in Angus was actually around our prescribing budget in Angus, and in Tayside generally it was a bit of an outlier nationally. It was much higher than most other boards. So we needed to bring that down, and the importance of making sure it was clinically appropriate to bring that down was critical. So there was some research went into that. GPs did a kind of rolling assessment of what they were prescribing, and particularly focusing on people who were on 10 medications or more. Because there comes a point when having that number of medications, you know, what is it actually doing, and what are the effects and counter effects, and are they working against each other? So they focused on a key number of meds on that. And the Health and Social Care Partnership in Angus gave a significant amount of money to our local third sector organisation, Voluntary Action Angus, and we have 8 social prescribers split evenly across the 4 localities in Angus. And what they are doing is working in our GP practices and health centres alongside the GPs to support people in a non-medical intervention that has actually reduced the number of painkillers being prescribed, the number of antidepressants being prescribed. People are feeding back that they are feeling better in themselves, they're taking more physical activity, they're less isolated, loneliness is being addressed, they're getting engaged with other third sector organisations like open garden schemes or community allotments, volunteering themselves to help people who are perhaps clinically vulnerable and shielding and still not able to have much of a life outside over COVID. And that has the benefit to the individual, for me, is the massive win. But the other benefit is that it's reducing our financial costs around our prescribing budget, which we are then able to use in a different way to improve health and well-being, and not just addressing ill health and very many comorbidities that are often related to poverty.
Yeah, well, I think it's that thing about whether you're an active or a passive engaged person with your health. And if you are someone who's just being handed tablets, then it does feel quite passive. How widely rolled out is social prescribing in Scotland?
I don't think it's widely rolled out. Okay. There are some areas, and there are, I think NHS Lothian has a green NHS model going, which is fantastic. But I know from my role in Public Health Scotland as well that the importance of place and well-being is right up front and central. We have a director of place and well-being, and I mean that feeds over into things like town planning. There's a place standard tool that has been used across the country, and the importance of connecting people with the blue and the green, with water and with nature, with trees, with hedgerows, is really important to people's well-being. And that's actually one of the positives that have come out of our experience of COVID. People were going out and going for walks much more often, engaging with nature, and people in cities and towns finding green spaces to do that. And that has a real benefit to everyone's health and well-being. And do you know, as a relatively recent gardener, I really only started growing my own veg as part of my post-Brexit apocalyptic preparation. That digging your, thrusting your hands into soil and feeling the earth and, seeing things grow is an experience that is now more widely available to more people through community allotments and projects that allow people to experience nature as a therapeutic activity. And it's amazing.
Kind of brings us back to COP26.
Yeah.
Anyway, we'll keep an eye on this whole notion of social prescribing. Something that interests me, and we might look to delve into that a bit more. Interesting, you're saying that more people, especially from towns and cities, began to engage with the countryside. Of course, some of them didn't engage particularly well, and the etiquette of engaging with the countryside was ruined in some parts of Scotland, and that was a real issue for local communities. A new survey has just been published which claims that 65% of people asked in Scotland think that broadcasting rights should be devolved to the Scottish Parliament. Obviously, they're not at the moment. SNP's John Nicholson has said that the needs and responsibilities need to rest but with those who live and work here. Now, of all of the extra powers, Elaine, that could be devolved to Scotland, and there are a whole list of them that we were promised after 2014 that haven't come, what difference do you think, if any, would devolving the rights of broadcasting to Scotland make?
I think there's a wider debate in society at the moment about broadcasting rights and about, TV licenses, etc., etc. So I think social media has changed, and social platforms has changed a lot of how people access their news and their information as well. There's far more plurality about where you can go to for that kind of information. So yeah, it's a wider debate in society. So it's natural that I think it should happen at this level, that there is a discussion over broadcasting rights. So yeah, I think the more information you have from a range of platforms, and the more you can see yourself in different types of broadcasters, it can be no bad thing. So yeah, I think that's a fair proposition.
I guess, Jools, one of the things that would affect would be regulation. So it might, for example, mean independent broadcasters like Broadcasting Scotland got either more money or got a bigger slice of the cake, or had more support than they currently do. What do you think would be the benefits of devolving broadcasting rights to Scotland?
And I think I agree with what Elaine was saying. If we are raising our licence money to fund broadcasting in Scotland, then we can be sure that 100% of that money is going to be spent on productions in Scotland. And we can build our own workforce, our talent base to support that. And I think that's a positive. And I'll be honest, I don't have a TV licence, I don't have a TV, and I won't fund the BBC as it is. But if that became a devolved authority, I would reconsider that position if I could see the benefit of that being delivered, and we felt that we were getting our money's worth.
Well, I think it doesn't worry me about this survey, and we don't know how many people were asked, we don't know how big it was, but I think a lot of people might take that view, that they're unhappy with the perceived bias of the BBC, and to a slightly lesser extent the independent channels, and that somehow if it was devolved to Scotland that would all change. But that's kind of implying that maybe the Scottish Government would have some influence on that, and it's absolutely essential that our broadcasters, especially national broadcasters, do not have government interference, are not there as a mouthpiece for government. So I'm not sure that it necessarily would change, but it worries me that maybe this is what's driving some of this interest.
But I think if you look at the BBC board of directors in London, it's England centric. There's I don't know if there's any representation in Scotland at all, but why not set up a similar model here? Why would that need to be perceived as Scottish Government interference?
It's interesting, Elaine, that you were saying that it's part of a wider debate about just how we get our news, social media, and whatever. I mean, that really is now ramping up in some regards, not least with Facebook changing its name of its company to Meta, which apparently is also very similar to the Hebrew word for dead. And so there's been quite a few comments. Is this Facebook announcing its own demise? But it might help, or it may not help, I don't know, put an end to spin. So spin is something that, is relatively new within the political sphere in the UK. We've been talking about spin maybe for 10, 15 years, spin doctors. And it's just been announced that the Scottish office, Alistair Jack's Scottish office, has spent over £1 million on spin doctors. So do you think it's time to just put an end to spin doctors across all political parties and political platforms, Elaine?
Well, I mean, taking the first part of your question, I don't think there's anything to be feared from plurality of access of information. I think people should have an access to different types of information. It's choice. In terms of spin, do I think that should be stopped? I fail to see how it could be, because I think it's part of our society now. And I unfortunately live in a sector, I work in a sector where we see a lot of that, the major headlines that have very, very minimal basis in reality quite often. So of course it's very upsetting. You're trying to combat some of this quite a lot of the time. But do I think we can stop that happening? I really don't know how you can. I think social media certainly has played a massive part in rolling this out, because everyone has access to a platform where they can put information out now. And it's being used to the maximum for all different types of sectors and parties. So as much as it might be nice not to have it, I'm not sure how you stop it.
But the point is, I mean, the money that Alistair Jack and other political departments and other political parties are using, especially parties in government, is public money. That's £1 million of public money, Jules, that he's spending, that he could be maybe spending better.
Well, I think it shows that they're pretty much running scared. And I think, to pick up on Elaine's point, you're never going to get away from people trying to score over others. What we need to do is encourage and educate people to be more discerning in what they believe online and how they interrogate the veracity of information that they're picking up online. And if you're just looking at that figure as a bald statistic, you're going to be thinking, am I going to be believing the stuff they're putting out? They're clearly panicking.
Well, social media, of course, is a blessing in some regards, in as much as it does give people a wider access to information that they didn't have. But there is a suggestion, really, that you're singing to the choir. You're speaking to people who support you, and that's perhaps nowhere less on Twitter. Although maybe that mould has been slightly broken. There has been a positive story about positive campaigning for independence in the last couple of weeks, and that's Will Cruikshank's campaign, hashtag Scottish Independence 1, and then adding Scottish Independence 2 for a number of days. It's had over 1.5 million retweets and has been generally widely accepted. Jules, is this 1.5 million people that would support Scottish independence anyway, or do you think it's reached a wider audience? And it has generally been positive, which not all independence campaigning is. So what do you think?
I think, well, without knowing the details, the sense I get is that it's maybe encouraged people who were a bit more passive, to come out and state their support for independence, because social media can be quite a scary place, and it can be difficult for people to stick their head above the parapet on something. It is good to see that positive engagement, and certainly you couldn't switch on Twitter without seeing a flood of saltires in front of you for the last couple of weeks. And more power to Bill's elbow in terms of supporting people to be vocal, if I can use that word, on social media. And it has got people talking, and good on you.
Elaine, one of the themes that you've been really strong on today is this idea of polarity, that it's important that we avoid it. It doesn't get anybody anywhere. In one regard, Twitter is the absolute enemy, isn't it, of people getting together. It's all about division. It's all about polarity. So what do where do you think in the run up to, well, we've got council elections next year, and then we'll have, goodness knows when we'll have a next UK government election. That'll be for Mr. Johnson to decide when he's, thinks he's leading the poll has got higher or whatever. We might have a Scottish independence referendum within a couple of years. Do you have any hope that social media, and Twitter in particular, is ever going to be anything except divisive and nasty when it comes to political campaigning? Do we just write it off as a platform for sharing information?
I don't think you can write it off, because I think if you don't engage in some ways, the messages out there, there are messages out there that may not be challenged in any way. And I think Jools had mentioned about discernment of information, and I think that's the key. How do we get people to discern in accordance with their own moral values what's going to be right or wrong, or what suits them? In terms of social media, certainly, I mean, I can only guess it's very similar to how we find it. There's so much good news that we would like to share and that we would like to talk about, and things that we'd like to suggest or issues that we could work on. But we often find quite a lot of our time is spent kind of dispelling myths or dispelling things. And I think that's what's true with political issues as well. So, I mean, I hope that there are positives that come out of Twitter. There certainly are. It connects people the world round, but I do see the issues with it as well.
Maybe we need more independent broadcasting in Scotland then to get your positive messages out, because we would love to be the kind of voice for that. Which brings us to the end of the programme today. Thank you both very much for joining me. And it's interesting that we had a story about broadcasting, because, as you know, we're always reminding you that it takes money to keep Broadcasting Scotland going. And if you believe in independent broadcasting that gives a different slant to stories that you might not get in the mainstream press, then please think about supporting us financially. www.broadcastingscotland.scot/register and see if you can't make a regular donation to help us. We've got a lot of interesting plans for the station coming up, and we really want to up the amount of coverage that we're giving. We're going to be doing quite a lot over COP26, and we have got the ability to really be a much bigger, stronger and more vibrant broadcasting outfit, but it takes cash. So go on, have a look, put your hand in your pocket, you know you want to. In the meantime, I hope you all have a lovely Sunday afternoon. I don't know what the weather's like. It's pretty bad here in Glasgow, so you might not be able to get out and embrace that nature that Jools has been so promoting on this programme. But maybe you just want to sit still, watch an old movie, and don't burn too many fossil fuels. Thank you both very much. Have a nice Sunday. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
What distinguishes Broadcasting Scotland from a website or blog, apart from our brilliant programmes?
Hi there, I'm Gordon Ross.
Are the costs we face to enable us to produce those programmes. These costs are significant and ongoing. However, our facilities are able to do so much more if only we had the staff. In the last year, some of our supporters have cancelled their subscriptions. In one way, we would prefer it if it was because they didn't like us, rather than it being because of the financial pressures which we are all under because of COVID. The really positive outcome of our fundraiser is that at a time of economic challenge in Scotland, we will use your donations to create jobs and in a small way contribute to improving the Scottish economy. If you want us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster, able to provide an alternative mainstream television platform, then please support us.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
Just imagine what we could do if we had even 1% of the BBC Scotland channel's budget. Imagine. And then please consider turning your imagination into reality. Please support us if you can afford it.